Well, greetings, friends. It won't surprise you. Well, let me just welcome you to the Danielle Smith Show. I'm Danielle Smith. It won't surprise you that today I'm going to spend quite a bit of time going through this court decision that came down from the Court of Appeal yesterday on the issue of what has been called Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Act. I regret that we've been calling it that because that's not what it is. What it is the no more building of anything in Alberta ever again act as it relates to natural resources or anything else the federal government decides. That is fundamentally why 4-1 judges in the Court of Appeal yesterday came down and said, let's cut the crap here. We're calling out what this actually is. It's gutting the Constitution. And if it is allowed to stand, it constitutes an existential threat to the survival of the country. Let's be very frank about what has happened here. And the reason why I say we need to be looking at this broader than the issue of pipelines. Because the interesting part about it, as the court acknowledges, is that no one is actually disputing the federal government's authority to make decisions on cross-border issues. Like we can fight and we can be frustrated and we can work to change government and we can make our case and we can lobby, but the Constitution's pretty darn clear. The Constitution says that if a pipeline goes across borders, whether it's between provinces or whether it's down to the United States, if a transmission line goes across borders, whether it's across provinces or down to the United States, regardless, the federal government has jurisdiction over that. And we accept that there is a federal regulatory process to that. What we do not accept is the fact that they are able to designate essentially any project that they choose for any criteria, for any reason that exists and would normally be approved through provincial processes. They're allowed to designate that a federal project, and that's the nature of the problem that we have. So I want to walk through some of the legal jargon that came through here. I haven't had a chance. It's a very long summary. It's 209 pages. I was reading through this, like, oh my goodness, get to the point already. But it's a very long summary. And I read through to page 124, which is the affirming judges and what they had to say. It's still really important for us to read on the other side as well, what the dissenting judges have to say, because in the dissenting judges is where we're going to find the seeds of what the federal government is going to use to try to keep this law from standing. And it won't surprise you that what has happened is the federal government, Stephen Guilbeault, has already said full steam ahead, will be appealing this to the Supreme Court. And he made sure as well to say that we are not allowed to act on any of the judgment in this act because it was only advisory and doesn't have the force of law. Well, I've got a solution for that one too. But I want to go through this as well because I've been contemplating and trying to figure out why the federal government seems to have control over everything we do. It occurs to me that this incursion is just a regular feature of Confederation, that it took the 1930s Resource Transfer Act for us to assert that we had the same right as other provinces were granted at Confederation over our lands and our resources and our ability to develop them. That was the Natural Resources Transfer Act. It happened under Premier Brownlee. And I thought that that was the end of the story. Then, of course, in the 1970s, when we started developing our oil and gas resources and we started seeing international energy crises, all of a sudden the federal government came in with their national energy program and decided that they were going to set the rate for oil and gas prices in the country, as well as regulate how much we were able to export. That was one of the fights that Peter Lougheed got into in 1982. That was also remedied in the Constitution. There's a specific section of the Constitution that was put in place to make sure this never happened again. Section 92A that says that we have the exclusive jurisdiction to develop our resources, as well as to develop our own electricity and transmission infrastructure within our province. It's right there in the Constitution. So how in the world did the government come back and create a law in Parliament that allows them to essentially have a veto? And yes, that's what the court says, a veto over any decision that we make within the province. So let's define some terms. The term intra-provincial means anything within our borders. And this is where I think I have maybe undersold just how intrusive and dangerous to national unity this bill is, because true. I mean, we've been frustrated about the national Northern Gateway pipeline being canceled. We were frustrated that Energy East pulled the plug after $1 billion worth of investment. We were frustrated that the federal government didn't stand up for us when it came down to Keystone XL. We were frustrated that Quebec also didn't allow for us to take our Western gas and export it off Port of Saguenay through an LNG project. So all of these things were frustrating, yes. But what is even more frustrating is when Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault says, yeah, we're going to approve this project in Newfoundland and Labrador, but we think that this Suncor expansion of their oil sands project does not fall within our federal objectives for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so I guess that you sort of scratch your head and say, well, why do they have any decision to render on this at all? And it's because they are designating these projects within their area of jurisdiction. So let's talk about this. Intra-provincial should mean anything within our borders we control. So if we decide that we want to establish a natural gas power generation plant, we have the ability to do that. If we want to have transmission lines that connect our various business centers within Alberta and do not go cross border, we are supposed to have the power to do that. If we want to establish pipelines that take our natural gas from one part of the province to another part of the province without crossing provincial borders, we have the right to do that. But this is why Bill C-69 was so sinister, is it actually took all of that away from us. So let me go through, and I will, don't believe me, I'll have you believe the courts, because it is, to me, what I find really interesting about how they judge this is that if we do not remedy this problem, they call it an existential crisis. So it's worth it to read, if you will, just the introduction, if you can. I know it's hard going through all of this legislation and the legalese, but I think just even reading the introduction will give you a sense for how they're framing it. So first of all, we've got sustainable economic development cannot be achieved without a sustainable, healthy environment and society. Since we all want a healthy biosphere in which to live, we expect our governments to make informed decisions about proposed larger scale projects in this country in a careful and precautionary manner. The utility, therefore, of environmental impact assessments of such projects to determine their environmental, social, economic, health impacts is undisputed. This has been unanimously recognized by all four governments and all intervenors who participated in this reference. And so nobody is disputing the fact that this is an important issue. We need to figure out how to develop our resources. We need to do so, ensuring that we're taking care of the environment and looking at social and making sure that we're respecting rights of First Nations. No one is disputing that. But listen to how they continue. Times of great change often lead to pressures to centralize power. Popular thinking may consider a central government to be suited to manage whatever change dominates public discourse. Today, that discourse most certainly includes climate change. The increasing frequency of weather events related to climate change and their detrimental effects are evident. The need to act with urgency on this front is undeniable, but this cannot be confused with the issue at stake here. So yes, fair enough. Everybody wants to act on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. It says, but the court goes on to say this reference is not about the legitimate concerns all government and citizens have today about climate change, nor how to address them, nor is it about the anxiety many rightly feel about the subject. Rather, the issue before the court is whether Parliament has overstepped the limits of its constitutional mandate under Canada's constitution. So there's a couple of questions that they have to deal with there. One is whether this, and it's called the Impact Assessment Act and the Canadian Energy Regulation Act. And they're asking whether it is unconstitutional in whole or in part. That's question number one. Question two is whether it is unconstitutional in whole or in part by purporting to apply to certain activities that relate entirely in the authority of the provinces. That is the part that I want to get into, because it's really important that we understand just how far the overreach actually goes. So continuing on, if you look at this, they say climate change constitutes This is section 6. Climate change constitutes an existential threat to Canada. So I think it's important that that be stated there, because it's not like the court is discounting the concerns that were put forward. It's not like anybody is arguing that they don't want to act on this. I think that's crucial. It says, but climate change is not the only existential threat facing the country. The Impact Assessment Act involves another existential threat, one also pressing and consequential, and that is the clear and present danger this legislative scheme presents to the division of powers guaranteed by our Constitution and thus to Canada itself. This reference shines a spotlight on the crucial feature of federalism built into our constitutional framework. History teaches that governments by central command rarely works in a geographically large country with a diverse population and divergent regional priorities. In most major democratic countries in the world, federalism and its associated principle, subsidiarity, have been insisted upon by the governed. That includes Canada, which by deliberate choice is a federation and not a unitary state. That we have to understand that this country exists by choice. It exists by negotiation. It exists by the various foundational documents that we have that represent a compromise. We can put a little water in our wine on certain issues, but you've got to leave us jurisdiction to take care of our other areas of jurisdiction. That was the foundational premise of Canada when we came together in 1867, revised through the 1930 Resource Transfer Act, reaffirmed through the 1982 Constitution Act. And what we're seeing is that the government is trying to throw that completely out the window. I think there's one more section that I want to show you here just before we move on. So under the Constitution, the environment is not a head of power assigned to either parliament or provincial legislature. This is important because what they go on to say is when either government level legislates for purposes related to the environment, that legislation must be linked to a specific head of power within its jurisdiction. A meritorious motive, protection of the environment, does not by itself found constitutional jurisdiction for either level of government. So the notion that they can say because the environment is so important and we declare that we have an interest in it, therefore we can usurp your area of provincial jurisdiction, that does not stand. So let me go on to this next section because I want you to see who the suspects are who engaged as intervenors in this case. So what happens when the government puts forward a case? They ask other parties who have an interest in the outcome to intervene so that they can also submit briefs and make their case. So in the case of the provincial government, on their side were Ontario and Saskatchewan, as well as the Woodland Cree First Nation, the Indian Resource Council, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, the Independent Contractors and Business Association, and oh look, the Alberta Enterprise Group, all intervened in support of Alberta's position. You want to see who the usual suspects were on the other side? Well, this is going to surprise you at all. So these are the folks who intervened on behalf of the federal government supporting its position. Nature Canada. Oh, look at this too. Eco Justice Canada Society, Mining Watch Canada Inc., the Canadian Environmental Law Association, Environmental Defense Inc. Wonder where they got their money from. Gosh, if only someone would do a public inquiry to find out whether U.S. foreign foundations are sending hundreds of millions of dollars into Canada to stop our resource development. If only someone would do an inquiry into that. Also, the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and Mikisew Cree Nation intervened in support of Canada. There's a couple of interesting parts, I think, to that as well, is that what I think we should take away is that we had Indigenous groups intervening on both sides. And this to me is something that Stephen Buffalo has made me quite aware of, is that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it has been framed almost exclusively as a piece of governing legislation that would stop any kind of resource development. But do you know how the First Nations, like the Indian Resource Council and the National Coalition of Chiefs and other aligned groups look at it, they look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons as saying that the federal government has no right to interfere when they do want to develop it. And that's a piece that I think is gaining more traction, especially as First Nations leaders realize that the only way to address poverty in their communities is to take up an equity stake and own and buy some ownership in some of these projects, which increasingly they're being allowed to do. Now, here is the nut of why I think when we've been calling this the No More Pipelines Act, we kind of missed the point about why this is so offensive to provincial jurisdiction. So in this section, they talk about the activities included under the act. And again, I don't think anybody is going to be surprised that the federal government is going to claim jurisdiction on any development that takes place in a national park or a federally protected wildlife area. They're not going to be surprised that the federal government is going to assert its right to develop any specific matters related to military or defense. No problem there. Uranium or mills. That's another one. Uranium mines or mills. So Saskatchewan's resource on uranium, sure, that's something that the federal government has an interest in and is going to develop. And I don't know that anybody is seriously challenging that. Nuclear facilities. We might end up trying to get more of those developed as we go to small modular nuclear, and provinces are very keen on that. But I don't think anyone is seriously disputing that the federal government shouldn't be the one who makes the decision on that. Offshore oil and gas, that's obviously an issue for our friends on the East Coast, and they have their own frustrations there, but it is offshore, it's in international waters, it has multiple jurisdiction issues. I think we accept again that the federal government should be allowed to make decisions on that. New international electrical transmission lines, if it goes cross-border into the United States, fair enough. Offshore oil and gas pipelines, same thing. Interprovincial oil and gas pipelines. So if we cross border into Saskatchewan, obviously, we can't impose anything on Saskatchewan, and that is why you need the federal jurisdiction. Once again, no one's surprised there. Offshore wind power, again, because it's offshore, by definition, it falls outside one particular jurisdiction, falls in the realm of federal government. Fair enough. Aerodromes and runways, international and interprovincial bridges and tunnels, canals or causeways, marine terminals. Okay, so again, those are the areas that you would fully expect the federal government to have an interest in determining whether there's going to be development or not, and having the ultimate say on environmental impact. But look at this. Importantly, however, designated projects also include intra-provincial activities. Those are things that are within provincial jurisdiction, within provincial borders, such as renewable energy, transportation, oil and gas. The following activities designated in the regulations are matters primarily within exclusive provincial jurisdiction. So look at the kind of things that they want to have exclusive jurisdiction over. Any coal, diamond, metal, rare earth element, stone quarry, sand, gravel pit exceeding a specified daily production capacity. So when the federal government deems anything gets to be large enough, they're going, and it's 100% within our borders, they are going to declare that they have the jurisdiction to govern it. That's what this impact assessment statement does. This impact assessment act is it took over jurisdiction over everything that we have traditionally decided on ourselves once it reaches a certain size. Continuing on, certain activities with respect to existing new oil sands mines with a bitumen production capacity of 10,000 cubic meters per day or more. Sorry, guys, I didn't do the translation on that, but 10,000 cubic meters a day or more is a relatively small operation. So as soon as it reaches that size, federal government saying we get to decide. Construction, operation, decommissioning, abandonment, or expansion of a fossil fuel-fired power generating facility with a production capacity of 200 megawatts or more. So think about that. So if we wanted to rebuild, call it the Shepherd plant in Calgary, which is 800 megawatts, natural gas fired plant, we wouldn't be allowed to do that without federal permission. I knew that the federal government was overreaching when they said that they were going to ensure that we had no natural gas or fossil fuel production of electricity after 2035. This is the act that allows them to do it. Any plant that is over 200 megawatts or more, they're declaring a federal interest in, and they give the final approval. It continues construction, operation, commissioning, abandonment, and expansion of an in situ oil sand extraction facility when the bitumen production exceeds 2,000 cubic meters per day or more in a province that does not have provincial legislation limiting the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced by oil sands, or in the province or where such limits have been reached. So when Rachel Notley agreed to the cap on oil sands production, we thought that that gave us a lot of latitude to develop. And the way the government is interpreting this, it's questionable. They want to step in and be able to develop or to regulate and veto any of the SAGD operations that we have in the oil sands area. It continues construction, operation, decommissioning, or abandonment of new expansion of existing oil refineries, facilities to liquefy petroleum products from coal to natural gas, sour gas processing facilities, petroleum storage facilities, natural gas liquid storage facilities, above specified production or storage capacities. Any of those are going to be large operations. So that means that they're going to kibosh any second level value added production that we do within our own borders. Anything that's happening up in the Fort Saskatchewan, Sturgeon County, and Strathcona County area, all of that, by virtue of this, comes under the purview of the federal government, even though none of it crosses the border, and there should be no reason why they would intervene. It continues. The construction, operation, decommissioning, and abandonment of a new and expansion of an existing hydroelectric generating facility over a certain production capacity. So they're going to regulate as well, even if it's all within our own borders, any hydroelectric power on our river systems. The construction, operation, decommissioning and abandonment of all new all-season public highways that require a total of 75 kilometers or more of new right-of-way. So they're now going to get into provincial highway construction. We've got a pretty big province connecting a lot of different areas. If it goes beyond 75 kilometers of new road, they're going to step in. That would have required federal approval to build the ring roads around Edmonton, a ring road around Calgary. We're not going to be allowed to do those things anymore without the federal government saying so. Construction, operation, decommission, and abandonment of a new facility or expansion of an existing facility for the treatment of hazardous waste that's within 500 meters of a natural water body. So presumably, I guess, I don't know, I'd have to look at the Swan Hills plant, which we decided to do years ago. Maybe any of these new plants that are designed to deal with waste to energy, maybe all of those are going to require federal approval. And finally, the construction, operation, decommissioning, and abandonment of a new or expansion of an existing dam or dike or water diversion structure that exceeds certain limits. So I don't know. Does that mean, I guess that's the Springbank Dry Dam or any other of our infrastructure? If we wanted to develop out new irrigation infrastructure for our food producers, would we be allowed to do that? Not without federal permission. See what I mean? Like, that is at the heart of what this is about. It's not really about the issue of pipelines. It's about the issue of everything else. And if you want me to if you think I'm over interpreting this, the court is super clear about the invasion in every single aspect of our lives that this bill constitutes. Look at Section 294. To bring this down to reality, there are several ways greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced. So this is what you're giving up. If you decide that the federal government is the one who gets to make all of the decisions on all of these factors, federal or provincial, for all of the different areas that they have outlined in law, that they believe that they have the ability to say no. There's 20 different areas, including an assessment of gender and sexual issues as well. They've got that enumerated in here, if you can imagine. But they have given themselves the latitude to say no on not only areas of their own jurisdiction, areas of provincial jurisdiction, and every social or environmental consideration that they want to without limit. So here's what it comes down to bring this down to reality. Lots of ways greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced. So if the full effect of what they've given themselves is put into effect, here's what they say. A few examples, which admittedly are at the end of this extreme, but for illustrative purposes only. They could limit the number of children per family. This legislation allows them to do that. They could they could legislate that we have to stop eating beef and become vegetarian. They could legislate that we have to stop drinking dairy milk, stop living in single family homes, limit the square footage of a person, couple, or family, limit what they can occupy, limit home heating above a certain prescribed temperature, and stop cooling homes below a prescribed temperature. Stop using gas appliances. Stop driving vehicles that cannot achieve a stringent mileage level per liter. Stop driving vehicles of any kind. Stop taking holidays that involve leaving home by plane, car, or bus. Stop eating as much. Stop spending as much on consumer goods. Shut down all cruise vessels and all plane travel for pleasure. Shut down the dairy and cattle industry. Shut down all cement plants. Shut down the auto industry and aerospace industry. Shut down all electrical power generation plants. Shut down the production and export of coal. Shut down the entire Canadian oil and gas industry. That is the consequence of what they've allowed them to do in this legislation. Do you see why they call this an existential threat to Canada? Because it's interesting to me that they do that list of enumerated areas that the federal government could decide are important areas of policy that they're now able to do. Because isn't this what some of the extreme environmentalists are suggesting that we should do? And so this becomes the mechanism for them to be able to do that. How long do you think we will have unity in this country if the government acts on these kinds of issues? So here's the other part that I think, so that's sort of the extreme end of what the government has given themselves the ability to do. But I think this is equally important when they talk about the practical effects of the Impact Assessment Act. One of the practical effects is the issue of delay. It's indisputable. One of the practical effects of the act is delay. Given the structure of this legislative scheme, this is not surprising. At every point that counts, when a step is to be taken or a decision is to be made by the minister or governor and council, that's the term for cabinet, there is no enforceable deadline by which that step or decision must be made. In particular, there is no requirement that the decisive decision-making step, the issuance of a decision statement, which includes the public interest determination, will be made by the minister or governor and council within a finite time frame, reasonable or not. Instead, the act permits an endless loop of delay. Endless loop of delay. And again, it's one thing when you're talking about pipeline projects. It's as I said, that is at least an area of their jurisdiction. But every single area of provincial jurisdiction enumerated above, we could have endless loops of delay that ensures that we are never able to get to the finish line on any large project ever. So that's one practical effect. Practical effect number two, uncertainty. Another practical effect of this statutory regime is uncertainty. If there were one consideration above all other that militates strongly against investment in any country, it is uncertainty. Investors crave certainty. The investing in intra-provincial designated projects need to know and to be able to rely on the ground rules that apply to a proposed project. This is especially so where those investments would potentially be measured in billions of dollars. Further, while Canada remains an importer of foreign capital, capital flows work both ways. Investors, both foreign and domestic, can vote with their feet if a country is not competitive on the investment front. Predictability and reliability of investing are essential to Canada's economic success in an integrated world. You know, the number of business leaders I have talked to who have told me, I just spoke with one last night, who told me that Canada used to be a green light when it came down to the issue of investment. And now we are a yellow light. We are at the same level of Argentina in how our investment climate is being judged because of the uncertainty, because you can't get approvals, because you've got this endless cycle of delay, because you've created uncertainty and capital is fleeing the country. Third practical effect is there's no practical remedy to federal action, or more importantly, inaction. A third practical effect of this statutory scheme relates to judicial review. Canada and its supporters submit that should the federal government overshoot the proper boundaries of its powers under the Act, there would be a remedy available in judicial review, but constitutionality does not turn on the availability or the efficacy of judicial review. An unconstitutional law is not made constitutional because the exercises of discretion thereunder are subject to judicial review. In any event, There isn't any practical way to hold the government to account when it comes right down to the issue of whether something is going to be approved or not. So this is where we find ourselves, my friends, is that we are in a position where anyone who proposes a project of any size can have Stephen Guilbeault, who clearly hates our energy industry, swoop in and say you're not allowed to do that, and they can have an endless cycle of delay with no end in sight, creating uncertainty with why would anybody invest here? What would be the point of that? So I was pleased to see, yes, the provincial government issued a strong statement, said that they're going to continue to challenge this to the Supreme Court. But look what Stephen Guilbeault did. He made it clear that he expects that we're going to continue to fall under this regime until it is heard by the Supreme Court. Where are we at now? How many years has this been fought? Do you remember how this went down? This went down under Rachel Notley's regime. And I remember getting through the House of Commons with virtually no pushback whatsoever. Remember, we thought we were going to get social license because we were playing ball. We shut down the coal industry early. We're converting all those natural gas plants. We put in a carbon tax. We decided to put a cap on oil sands. And do you remember that was supposed to solve all of these problems? So what did the federal government do? They use that as license to say, if you want to give up your area of provincial jurisdiction, don't you worry, we'll take all of it. And we didn't hear anyone kicking up a fuss until Rick Peterson from Suits and Boots in the 11th hour, when it was going through the Senate, decided to try to get the senators to reject both that and the C-48 bill as well. Came pretty darn close to doing it. But there was no 911. There was no, and even then, we were still talking about it in terms of pipelines only, not in terms of all of the things that are listed there, that we're not able to build a in-stream hydroelectric operation. We're not able to build a power plant that's larger than 200 megawatts. We're not able to have in situ oil and gas development. We're not able to expand refining operations. We're not able to do anything that allows for us within our own jurisdiction to make our own decisions. No one really kicked up a fuss about that part of it. So it went through the court, and here we are a couple years in. And now what we're supposed to do, we're just supposed to sit back for another couple of years and waiting for the Supreme Court to make their decision. No. Rob Anderson came up with a solution. If you've looked at his Free Alberta strategy, what did he say? He says that we need to immediately pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And what would that do? The Alberta Sovereignty Act would tell us that we are going to disregard any federal decision or any court decision that interferes in provincial jurisdiction. So now we have got a Court of Appeal ruling. 4 out of 5 judges, only 1 dissenting, said that this is outrageous, completely guts the Constitution. We are not a unitary state. We are a confederation, and this negates our confederation if it is allowed to stand. That seems to me to be pretty strong. That seems to me to be pretty clear that the end result is ultimately going to be that the Supreme Court has got to strike this down. So why should we wait? How many more billions of dollars are we going to see chased out of this province while we wend our way through waiting for the Supreme Court, which incidentally has 3 out of 9 judges appointed by Quebec? You'd think Quebec would be equally concerned about these interventions and the inability of them to develop their resources too. Or is this the problem? This is fundamentally the problem with our confederation, and they point this out too. Is it causes the federal government to be allowed to pick winners and losers among provincial projects. And guess who has the political power right now? So if Quebec proposes that they want to have a new cement plant or a new aluminum plant, do you think the federal government will intervene and say, no, you can't do that? We want to designate that a project that we approve? I doubt it. If Newfoundland and Labrador want to have an offshore project, I guess they can get it approved. But you know what, Suncor, you're out of luck. The federal government is in grave, grave danger. When you talk about existential crisis, the court identified this right from the beginning. We are in an existential crisis for the survival of the Canadian Federation. And this is the saddest part, I think, about the response from the federal government yesterday. It's they obviously didn't read the act or read the judgment. And if they did read the judgment, they just don't care. They just don't care. You sometimes think that people have higher-minded reasons for why they want to make decisions, but it's pretty clear that we've got an environment minister that simply wants to destroy Alberta's fossil fuel industry and destroy Alberta's autonomy over making its own decisions over its resources. There's no other interpretation that we can have other than that. And so, if that's going to be the case, if that's the federal government's response to Alberta giving an equalization referendum saying we want to eliminate equalization, the very next day, it seems, they instituted the most hostile environment minister that we could possibly ever dream of at the federal level. It's time for us to start asserting ourselves. We can't just simply wait and be passive on this. This is the time for us to start the strategy. You pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act and say we are looking at the Court of Appeal decision. We're not abiding this act anymore. We're going to collect our own income taxes. We're going to let you know that we are opting out of Alberta pension. We're going to opt out of employment insurance. We're not going to be bought with your money for childcare or dental care or long-term care or pharmaceutical care, because we understand what the gig is here. The gig is that you are trying to create a unitary state where we have no decision-making whatsoever. If we don't start pushing back on these things, look what they do. It's the whole classic argument of you give an inch, they take a mile. They have taken well more than a mile on this one. And I think that the Supreme Court, that's why I called it the cut the crap judgment, because they've called it out. There's no denying it now, that this is very clearly offside with the principles of Confederation, and it's dangerous to the country. With that in mind, I am going to read the other side of the argument, just so that we can see what kind of arguments they're going to raise. But I think this gives us full license now for us to be really putting Alberta first, charting our own course. Remember, I told you that one of my last sessions when I was on the air was with Gerard Belzile from the Montreal Economic Institute. And I did ask him the question of why it is Quebec was so hostile towards us. And his answer was, they're not hostile towards you. They just don't think about you at all. They're too busy thinking about themselves. And maybe it's time for Alberta to think about itself for a change. Couldn't agree more. All right, my friends, go have a look at the decision yourself. If there's anything you think I missed that we need to talk about next time around, you know what to do. Just send me a note, Danielle@daniellesmith.ca, and we'll talk about it again on Friday. Thanks so much. It's been the Danielle Smith Show, and I appreciate you tuning in.